Hello, welcome to another toefl listening video. Let's start.
In this lecture series, we're going to look at the most prominent anthropologists, those who have really helped the subject to what it is now. With this in mind, we definitely can't ignore the work of Franz Uri Boas, a German anthropologist born in 1858, who is generally known as the father of American anthropology. Before we can consider Boas's contribution, we need to look at the state anthropology was in before he came onto the scene. Although there was some serious work being done in anthropology at the time, the field was heavily peopled with untrained adventurers and armchair philosophers. Racial bias and bigotry was rampant. It was common practice for practitioners to put forward their own pet theories, grand sweeping theories, in which they prognosticated on the nature of man. As for evidence, well, they used small scraps of information haphazardly gathered and riddled with bias to back up the point they wanted to make. Boas's background countered this. His upbringing was liberal. His parents held a disdain for dogma, religious or otherwise, which meant that Boas was free to question different beliefs unhindered. He was attracted to the natural sciences and would collect minerals and seashells. As he grew older, he did more rigorous studies and experiments, and at university he studied an eclectic mix of mathematics, physics, and geography. What put him on the anthropological track was a geographical expedition to the Arctic that he took in 1883. Fascinated by the people, their appearance, their language, their traditions, and way of life, he came home adamant to make anthropology his life work. This background was, I think it's fair to say, fundamental with regards to what Boas brought to the field, because he introduced methodology and scientific rigor into the discipline. Scientific method dictated that you could only formulate theories and conclusions after thorough and rigorous data collection and the examination of hard evidence. Accurate conclusions required careful observation, and even these could and should be critiqued and restudied, in case sloppiness or bias had skewed the results. One of Boas's main contributions to anthropological thought was his rejection of the evolutionary approach to culture. This approach assumed that all societies progress through certain technological and cultural stages, in hierarchical form, until they reach the peak, the zenith, which of course was the Western European culture. An example was the progression from a maternalistic to a paternalistic culture. According to Boas, this was all bunkum. There was no process towards a so-called higher form of culture. Each society, he said, was uniquely adapted to the set of circumstances in which it had arisen. Each was the product of a unique and particular history. It wasn't halfway along the road to a lofty idea of civilization. It had already arrived. In this way, his ideas paralleled those of Charles Darwin, whose own conception of evolution was that change occurred in response to pressures and opportunities, and that the path of change could vary in a multitude of ways. For example, when Darwin surveyed the Galapagos, he did not deem the one variation of a species superior to another simply because it was larger or its markings more elaborate. Rather, he saw them all simply as unique adaptations to their own particular circumstances. This idea was what shaped Boas's work in museums, for which he was, at first, heavily criticized. At the time, museums were laid out in this very way. Cultures considered primitive were set out first, and then gradually more so-called advanced or higher cultures were set out in progression. But Boas rejected that. He insisted that museums focus on the cultural proximity of the groups in question. Boas also did a lot of work to destroy preconceived ideas of racism. Racial anthropologists of the day believed that human behavior was determined by an innate disposition. Boas worked to disprove this, asserting that behavior was the result of social learning. He also worked on physiological preconceptions. At the time, it was believed that head shape was a stable racial trait. Presumably, they were under the impression that Western Europeans naturally had larger brains and so were more intelligent. But Boas conducted a series of groundbreaking studies of skeletal anatomy, which knocked this idea on its head, concluding that cranial shape and size was highly malleable and depended on environmental factors such as health and nutrition. For Boas, the aim of anthropology was to understand how their experiences, their environment, their social learning led people to understand and interact with the world in different ways. And to do this, it was essential to gain complete understanding of the people's cultural practices. You couldn't just observe them from a distance through the eyes of your own culture. You needed to look at a whole range of things, its mythology and tribal lore, religion, social taboos, marriage customs, physical appearance, diet, handicrafts, means of obtaining food, and so on. To do this, anthropologists had no choice but to go on location, learn the language, and undertake an intense survey that cataloged all these different elements. As the burden of the task of studying culture grew, anthropology became divided into 4 distinct parts: human evolution, archaeology, language, and culture. In short, Boas left behind a considerable legacy to the field of anthropology, in terms of his scientific methodology, his cultural relativism, and his tireless efforts to end racial bigotry and oppression. He also did a great deal of fieldwork himself among indigenous groups, and inspired multiple generations of anthropologists to study and record the vanishing cultures of so many tribal peoples, especially Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, which has gained more and more significance over time as globalization blots out more and more indigenous cultures, perhaps forever. In this lecture series,